Λοιπόν, χαίρετε. Λέγομαι Alexandros Mistriotis and I got lost in language. So, hello. My name is Alexander Mistriotis, or Alexandros, and I was invited to contribute in the discussions and this research environment that you're trying to create these days. So, I think one important thing is to say welcome to our city, to those who come from abroad, because the context is relevant. All speakers have somewhere around this huge title, future text. So in my speech I will try to address both of these terms, and I will try to expand, if possible, the limits, and finally complexify the notions that we're dealing with. I am not a graphic designer, I'm not a historian, I'm an artist, and I have to deal with all these problems every day. So in a way, I'm going to share with you some of the elements that I've been working with, struggling to understand, develop, and deepen my experience dealing with form and content. So I propose that you relax while I try to accomplish my mission. So talking about future and text in Athens is relevant. First of all, because when we think about Athens, we think about the past. So why would we talk about the future in Athens? Actually, it's because in reality, if we want to see text with a new vision, we need to go to that moment where text almost didn't exist. So it is relevant because we say that the Greek alphabet is like one major stepping stone. Sometimes we say it's the starting point of writing and text. So that means that there was that moment where people wouldn't consider text as a given reality, and they had a lot of reflexes to reflect and object. So I will take the thread from the speech of Thomas before, Valenta, that was mentioning this famous passage from Phaedrus of Plato. And I will even read some part of it as a storytelling. So I've simplified the text. So you have Socrates starting in the middle of a discussion, telling a story about what was happening in Egypt, and he talks about the god that invented dices and games and most importantly, text writing. So he goes to the king at the time and he presents every single one of his inventions. And it's the god talking with the king. And the king gives a feedback about each one of them. So there is this discussion, and at the end he arrives and to the main subject, which is writing. And then he says that I invented a potion that will bring wisdom. So text is like a potion. It has, in reality, no form. And you drink it, and it is about wisdom. And then the king responds and says, "O most expert Thoth, actually it's the name of the god, you are the father of writing. Your affection made you describe its effects as the opposite of what they really are. In fact, it will introduce forgetfulness, and those who learn it will not practice using their memory because they will put their trust in writing. You have not discovered a potion for remembering, but for reminding. You provide your students with the appearance of wisdom, not with its reality." And at the end of that story, Phaedrus is replying with a very funny and at the same time significant phrase. He says, Socrates, you're very good at making up stories from Egypt or wherever else you want. So there's a doubt about the veracity of the text within the text. So what happens is that we can wonder still, even though there's no possibility for us to avoid text, whether text is good or bad. And I think that when we talk about the future of text, we are conditioned by the problems that the text introduced when it started developing. So in a way, the future is always a reflection about the past. So what happens is that there's a big struggle between text as something which is external to the body and external to the mind, and this kind of not only memory but also orality that is lost through the development and the extended use of text. So what is the direction that we are going to take regarding that? I think that we will try to make, and we're already trying to make text even more present so that we will not forget. So our dependence with text in the future, I think, will be even stronger than now. So the more we will try to avoid forgetting, the more we will get dependent on text. And we will try, most probably, to accumulate and record almost everything, terrified by the fact that our memory is not prioritizing anything. So that leads us to the second thing that I find important in the development of text, which is the question of the saturation. Because there is that anecdote with Degas, the French painter, that would go in the ball houses and the ballet, and he would come back at home, and then he would make his paintings with dancers. And what he used to say to people who wondered how could he memorize all these images and then make them, he would say that actually memory sustains what is essential. So since we try to record, and since texts are not in a dynamic relationship with our memory that tries to capture what is essential, there is this prioritizing muscle that is less and less exercised in a text-based culture. And I think that this is something that makes us a little bit incapable to forget. And that means also that because all this information is kept, actually it is drowning within itself. So text will be always accompanied with tools that will try to excavate, aggregate, and bring forth what is essential and meaningful, because battling with text is becoming more and more difficult. So another thing that happens with text that we have to deal with is exclusion. So there is a story that I heard many years ago about a French guy that went to Africa, and he was collaborating with some locals there. He left, and after a few years, something like 5 years, he had to go back. So it was for him a very dear memory, and he had made some pictures. So he printed these pictures, and he made some very well done printings, and he brought them to his friends years after. And when he presented his gift to his friends, they took the photographs, and the response was, after looking at it for a while, well, you know, I'm sorry, but I cannot read. And this is peculiar, because for us, images are reality. But in reality, images also are text. And there are people who are excluded in many ways that sometimes are not so easily understood by a culture of text. In Western civilization, at least, let's say, for the last 3 or 4 centuries, we have a very text-based culture, and I would say even for thousands of years. But that means that a lot of people that think with images, let's say, or with sound, are in a disadvantages regarding the other ones who are thinking with words. So the more we go further, it is clear that we will need to integrate more images within texts and integrate different ways to organize content and communicate content. So for graphic designers, this is more or less obvious, but at the same time, it is clear that one of the main tendencies was for a while to consider text as an image. So I think that we're still in a text-based concept, and in a way we will have to abandon a large part of our toolkit in order to embrace the power of images. So the most important problem, though, is that text is something dead. So in the same dialogue of Plato in Phaedrus, there's another passage which is equally famous. And what it says is that the problem with books is that they answer the same way to different questions. So a book will tell you every time the same thing. We can probably say that, well, this is not true because the perception is different. It's true. But the text itself, it keeps saying the same thing every time we read it. It's the same words. And this is a very profound, cultural, rich problem that has grave consequences. Because actually we must remind ourselves that in the beginning writing was for accounting and for law. So we would write the law, like the Mosaic law, so that it would be something that doesn't change. But at the same time, law can never embrace human reality. So we had always this problem of what Paul mentioned as the curse of law. And the curse of law is related to the curse of text. So the curse of law means that we have to abide to inflexible principles, which are not principles actually, it's the expression of principles. And we have this problem between the letter and the spirit of the law. And this is a very old problem that has been a serious issue in many different cultures and civilizations. So in the traditions that had a very rigid understanding of the text, like the Hebrew tradition, you have all this development of the notion of interpretation. So you have the Talmudic treatment of texts that make a text generating different texts and different texts and different texts in order to create space. So what we're doing today is that we create hyperlinks. But this is not dynamic enough. Probably we should try to find hyperlinks that would change regarding the context of the moment that the reader comes close to a text. So the written text is changing our relation with body and voice. And there's another story which I find quite interesting, which is that at the 2nd century AD, in Athens lived a very rich man. His name was Herodes Atticus, and he had a son that had problems in learning the alphabet. So probably he got desperate, and what he did is that he bought him 24 slaves that were at his age, 24 children. And he was supposed to play with them, and at the same time, he was controlling them, he was ordering them. That way, his son learned the alphabet. But I think this is a quite learning example because it is already a metaphor. In order to learn the alphabet, he had to revive it. He had to make every single letter a person, something which is with which you can play with, and something that can reply in a different way next time you call him. At the same moment, the same century, we have this famous anecdote where Ambrose of Milan is reading, and he's reading without a voice, because at the time, apparently almost everyone would read a text aloud, silent text, a text which is not the partition of a voice, didn't really exist. So there is that moment where Augustine of Hippo tries to look at his teacher, and he is surprised because he's reading without reciting. So slowly, slowly, the text has taken out the voice from the word. And I think that this is a very relevant issue today, that we're in search of a new orality. I think that our relationship with text has gained something by, in a way, making text even more poor. What I mean by that is that you've heard probably that one of the main differences between prose and poetry is that poetry, you always listen the text, and that in prose, it is a silent text happening inside. So what I find is that through our text-based culture, poetry, which is always closest to this orality, has been weakened in our understanding and in our experience. So another way to open up and liven up the text is through algorithms. So now what we're trying more and more is not to try a text, but to write different steps of evolvement of a text or of a thought. So I think that a lot of the writers of tomorrow will not be writing precisely texts. They will write algorithms that would create, amongst other things, text. So in our effort to create a living text, actually someone wrote the code for Alexa and Siri. This looks like someone responding to us, but in reality, it's a text. It's a text that is writing the expression in form of a text, of the logic of the text. So in reality, we are talking with a text that is interacting with us and with the environment of information available in the internet. So I think that one of the directions that we will take regarding this dead thing, trying to liven up text, is writing more and more waves of thinking processes and not finalized texts. You've probably heard about all these projects about artificial intelligence that is writing books, sometimes technical books, by resuming publications about some specific issues, And there was, in the month of April, I think, a publication, the first book that was published, that was written by a machine. But also we've had experiments of artificial intelligence trying to write poetry and prose. So this is one of the things. So I think that already in the old days, this problem of the algorithm was already applied. Like when Plato is writing about this problem of the text that always responds in the same way, well, actually, he's already proposing a solution. Because in reality, Plato didn't really write texts. He wrote plays. And within these plays, he's always creating dynamic meaning. So as I gave you this example of Phaedrus replying to Socrates by telling him, well, all these stories that you say, they're just inventions. Actually, he's doing precisely that. He's opening up the text. He's creating a dynamic relationship between elements of the text that do not let it close. Another example of that is that passage where Socrates in the Symposium is talking about the fact that in the future people wouldn't decide their profession, that the city would decide what and why you will do in your life. And usually we say that Plato is defending this position. So we consider Plato as the inventor of totalitarian regimes, etc., etc. Most probably. Nevertheless, at the end of this passage, there's someone who replies. And what he says is that, but you know, Socrates, living like that, it's not life, not even for pigs. And this phrase comes from a character which actually has the name of the brother of Plato. So it couldn't be more close to Plato himself. So he doesn't let us consider the text as something which is totally closed. He's creating within the message doubts and dynamic relationships between the elements that open up meaning. And it is difficult because we have all this apotheosis of Plato to understand that he, besides some letters that are fascinating, especially one, the seventh letter, all the other texts, all the texts that Plato wrote were dialogues, were theater plays. He never really writes a text which is a final declaration of something. It's always very dynamic. And also Aristotle, it's more or less the same. The texts that we have now are not, most of them, public texts. They were the notes that he had in his school, and they were lost for centuries because only a few of his books were really publicized. So in reality, this textual understanding that we have about philosophy has been a little bit confused by our tendency to trust text. And in the beginning of text and alphabet and things like that, thinking and text and poetry and theater were not very much trusted to fixed text. And this is why we have already in the Hellenistic times, we have lost an enormous amount of texts. We should be really surprised of the amount of text that arrived until us, because the people at the time were not trying to keep texts. The same thing goes in different cultures, like in the beginning of the 20th century, when the musicologists from France went to Syria and Egypt and they were trying to record music. Musicians were shocked. They were not able to imagine that music could be fixed. So there were a lot of effort to avoid, even though it is really precious today. Nevertheless, we should try to remember the fact that the music that we're listening is only the traces of something that actually happened. So today we consider a recording as the product, as the music, as the experience or the work of art. But it's just a reminder of something that happened. It is not really the actual work. So there's also this phrase from Gustav Mahler that says that in the partition you can put everything besides the essential. So there is this battle with meaning, which is not that old. And at the same time, it's the starting point of writing and text. My work as an artist is more or less related to theater and the public space. I must mention a little bit this so-called crisis thing that made us really try to reread and understand the texts that surround us. So one of these texts, especially nowadays, it's the city, it's the buildings, it's the spaces. And they tell stories and they give informations and they inform us about a lot of things. So I think that we can consider the whole city as a text as well. Once again, there's a very ancient paradigm about Plato again, because there is this dialogue named Critias that he didn't manage to finish. And in ancient Athens, for 600 years approximately, there was this building, the temple of Zeus Olympian, which is next to the rock of the Acropolis, that was unfinished. And there is this text of an ancient writer that says that the dialogue of Plato is like the temple of Zeus. So he was comparing a building with a text. And the truth is that the symbolic meaning of buildings is fundamental for our modern democracies and for all societies. So in reality, the text is an omnipresent concept. So we are trying to revive not only the texts, we are trying to revive everything that we address, we understand as a text. And I think that we will become more and more aware of the complexity of the world, and this is a terrorizing experience. So when you look at these glasses with augmented reality, that you look at a building and then you have some text coming in, it's the development of hypertexting and really reactive texts that will start to submerge almost all kinds of experiences. Also in the rabbinic tradition, when a book would be worn out, or burned, or because of rain destroyed, what they would do is that they would bury the text as if it was alive, trying to keep alive that memory that texts are not something static. We always try to bring forth what is vibrating within them. So the last thing that I would mention is that phrase from John that says that the verb became flesh. So actually it's the same kind of problem. There's that moment where truth becomes someone, and text is someone, something that you can talk with. And actually it responds to the same problem, to the fact that text has a tendency to be fixed. And by staying fixed, it cannot embrace the complexity of humanity and human relationships and history and human society. So what happens is that there is this nostalgia of life that at the same time we are so afraid because we cannot control. And within the New Testament, there's actually that story about the way to Emmaus. You probably know it already, but it is quite significant. What happens is that the verb, Christ, has been resuscitated, and there are two of his students that walk, and they're going from Jerusalem to a city which is rather insignificant, which is called Emmaus. And while they walk, they meet a stranger, and this stranger starts to talk with them, and what he says is really interesting, and they feel really well, and they really like his company. And at the end of the day, they put a fire, and they tell him to stay with them, not to go to this other place that he was planning to go, because it was so nice to be with him. After that, the verb that wasn't visible to them, he takes some bread, and then they realize that actually it was the teacher, the rabbi himself. And at the moment that they realize that it was that they were talking with the teacher, with the verb, then he disappears. So actually, the moment where the text becomes really alive, it's actually the moment where the text almost disappears. So our desire for this text, which is open and alive, it's at the same time a desire to be liberated by text. We all hope, in a way, that text will vanish. Thank you very much.